Hey there! In this video I want to take a look at comparing the R7 against the R3 in terms of their video capabilities. Yeah, I know this is a pretty unfair comparison. The R3 is coming in at 4 times the cost of the R7, but I've been really impressed with the R7, and I did a previous comparison comparing it against the R5, and it stacked up really well. So in this video I want to see if they're pretty comparable in terms of image quality and a bunch of other things, or what do you actually get for 4 times the cost? So, as I've been filming this whole thing on both cameras and switching back and forth between them, can you tell the difference between these two cameras? How about if I put them next to each other? Can you tell the difference between the two cameras? Did you get it right? All right, let's get into all the details. So if you own an R7 and are kind of curious what you might be missing in terms of, a flagship camera like the R3, or maybe you're looking to pick up an R7 or kind of wondering how it stacks up against some of the better cameras from Canon, this will be a great video for you. And if you're new to the channel, welcome. My name is Josh, and on this channel I focus on videography, content creation, and of course really cool camera gear. So if you're into that kind of stuff, you're in the right place. So we'll do a lot of in-depth testing in this video, and again, if you're new to the channel, you don't know, but I do put out longer comparisons and stuff so you can look and see and make your own decisions, but also give you my opinions too. So we'll go through a lot of different things between these two cameras, but first of all, probably the most important thing is image quality. So for all of these tests, they were all shot in the oversampled 4K mode. So 4K fine in this camera. This camera shoots in oversampled 4K at the base ISO of 800 in C-Log3. So take a look at these examples and you can compare the image quality. Well, I've been really impressed with the image quality coming out of the R7 since the camera came out. I've compared it with a lot of other cameras, including the R5, and in this case against the R3, I think it was almost identical, and I think a lot of that comes from shooting in C-Log3. So overall, really impressed with the image quality. Of course, there's a little bit of difference being an APS-C sensor and a full-frame sensor, so in those examples, I did my best to match focal length and depth of field. So now let's get on talking about low light. And again, this is an APS-C sensor, so you assume it's not going to do as well as the full-frame sensor, but this is done really well in a lot of other tests, and I want to do a direct comparison here. So the way that I do my low light tests is I set my exposure using a gray card and 35% in C-Log3. I keep everything else the same. I just raise the ISO, and then I lower the key light intensity to get the proper exposure on the gray card. So take a look at the low light comparison between these two cameras. Overall, the R3 definitely beat the R7, totally not expected, but the R7 I think is clean until 6400, whereas it gets to 8000 and up, it gets a little bit noisier, but it's really usable up through the higher ranges, and it's a very impressive camera, especially for an APS-C sensor at this price point. Now let's talk about dynamic range between these two cameras. Now they're gonna both be shooting in C-Log3, so I kind of expect similar results. So the way I do this is I get my exposure using a gray card and 35% in C-Log3. For the overexposure test, I will set the exposure at f16, and then for each stop of light, I'll just open up the aperture by 1 stop. And then when I bring into the computer, I grade it at 0 stops. And then for the overexposed images, I just adjust the exposure, but I don't touch the color. And similarly, for the underexposure test, I will set it at f2.8 and then close down the aperture to underexpose the image and then just raise the exposure in post. So when you're looking at this, take a look at noise levels and colors, and you'll sort of see the differences between the two cameras, and then I'll show you some actual real life examples. Well, I was really not surprised that the dynamic range was pretty similar between these two cameras. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we're kind of limited by C-Log3. These cameras don't have C-Log2, and it looks like they perform very similar because of that. In the overexposure test, they were good through 4 stops over, and the image started to break at 5 stops over, so very similar in the highlights. In the shadows, in the underexposure test, they were good till around -2 or -2 1/3 stops. After that, they get pretty noisy, and there's actually kind of a bit of a color shift going on in the R3 in the shadows. So with that in mind, I think they're pretty similar in terms of dynamic range, but let's take a look at a couple of real life examples here. And when you're looking at these examples, I'm always looking at the highlights and the shadows. How smooth is the highlight roll off, or how pleasant do the highlights look, and how noisy and how much detail is in the shadows. And between these two shots, I think they looked very, very similar. Now let's take a look at the autofocus. I've had no complaints about the autofocus in either of these two cameras, both for shooting myself and also for out shooting wildlife and things like that. They've been really impressive. I don't know in terms of the way that they process the image, but they've both been great. Now let's take a look at the Ibis test. We'll do a walking vlogging test in a couple different modes and also a static shot. Overall, I think the Ibis is great on these two cameras, and I think one of the biggest critiques about the Canon's Ibis system is the wobbles in the corners on wide-angle lenses. I don't think you see it as much on the R7 because of the crop, because even at 15 millimeters, it's not super wide. Also, maybe the fact that the sensor is smaller inside this camera, it has more room to move around in the RF mount. I'm not really sure. I've had no complaints about the Ibis other than those wobbles. I've done some wildlife shooting handheld with these cameras with a lens with stabilization. It works great. And as you saw for the static shots, the Ibis just works awesome. I really do think the Ibis, in combination with the lens stabilization on a lot of these on a lot of these combinations, work really well. Now let's take a look at rolling shutter, and as you take a look at this example, you can see that the R3 does way better than the R7, and that is totally expected. The R3 has a stack sensor, and the R7 is doing that oversampling. So for those of you who are worrying about rolling shutter, the R3 definitely performs a lot better than the R7. I want to take a minute here to say this video is not sponsored, but it is made possible through all of your support. So if you've been enjoying this video and finding value in it, please consider hitting subscribe down below. It'd be greatly appreciated. Also, there are affiliate links in the description for these cameras and all the other gear I use on a regular basis. They don't cost you anything extra, and they really help support the channel. So I'd love it if you check those out. Also, hit subscribe. Thanks so much. All right, so we did a bunch of tests. Let's talk about what's the same between these two cameras. In 4K 24, which were all those tests there, they are amazing. They are super, super similar. So image quality, dynamic range, autofocus, Ibis for the most part. And in terms of low light, I'd say the R7 is close to the R3. The R3 is a little bit better, but great performance out of the R7. There's no recording time limits on these cameras, which is awesome. I mean, the R3 has a 6-hour recording limit, but come on. Basically no record limit, so I'm glad they got rid of that in the R7, which is still in the R5 and the R6. Also, the hot shoe, you can get the Tascam XLR unit because they have the fancy new hot shoe on this, so that's awesome. If you need XLR inputs, you can get that on both of these cameras. Now let's talk about the differences between these two cameras, and I think the biggest one is probably going to be the sensor. We have in the R7 a 32.5 megapixel APS-C sensor, and in the R3 we have a 24 megapixel stacked full frame sensor. So less megapixels on the R3, but the fact that it's stacked gives you a much quicker readout, helps with rolling shutter and a bunch of other photography stuff, and you know, a much nicer sensor in the R3. But of course, if you're looking for megapixels, the R7 has more megapixels. Now codecs, there's a big difference between these two cameras. The R7 will only shoot in IPB, whereas the R3 will shoot in IPB, all-I, and also 6K RAW. So if you're looking for, you know, codecs that aren't IPB, you probably need to look at cameras like the R3 and the R5. The R7 will only shoot in UHD, the R3 will shoot in UHD and DCI, and I think one of the biggest differences is the R3's 6K RAW capabilities, because you can do that up to 60 frames a second. I made a whole separate video about 6K RAW on this camera and sort of what that gives you and sort of those kinds of things. Basically, it gives you another stop of dynamic range in the highlights, and you get a much more pleasing highlight roll-off, much softer highlight roll-off, and you can see that in this clip here of this birdhouse. If you look at the grass, the highlights just look a lot more pleasant. And so if you're looking to get the most dynamic range out of the R3, you're gonna wanna shoot in 6K RAW, but the file sizes are absolutely huge. If you're curious about 6K RAW on this camera, go check out the video, link down below. So I've just been talking about 4K 24 frames a second for this whole video. Let's talk about higher frame rates. And there's a bunch of differences here between these two cameras. They both shoot in 4K 60, but the R3 can shoot in 4K 120. And even in 4K 60, they're gonna be very different. So the R3 has an oversampled 4K 60. The R5 only shoots, for example, oversampled up to 4K 30. So oversampled 4K 60 looks awesome in this camera. Now the R7 can shoot 4K 60 in two different ways. One is line skipped, so you'll lose some sharpness and detail. And the other way is a crop mode in 4K 60, which is a 1:1 readout, which is a pretty heavy crop. It's a 1.81 times crop on top of the already 1.6 times APS-C crop. So you have to punch in quite a bit, which can be to your advantage, but you're also gonna get a little bit more noise because you're reducing the size of the image coming off of the sensor. So let's take a look first at the example of comparing the 4K 60 in these two cameras. And as you can see, they're gonna look a little bit different. The R3 is gonna be a lot sharper, and when you punch in, you can really see that difference between the two cameras in terms of the image in 4K 60. The R3 does have 4K 120, but it only spits out in one way and in one codec, and that's gonna be all-I, and the bitrate is 1,880 megabits per second, which is a lot of data, so you have to be really careful with that. Also, it spits out in 30 frames a second, so 4 times slowed down, and then if you're shooting in 24 frames per second in your timeline, then you have to set the speed at 80%, not a big deal. The same thing sort of happens with the R7. You can shoot 120 frames per second in 1080p, but of course the file sizes are a lot more manageable. Another thing to mention is that the R3 has a crop mode, so you can punch in 1.6 times, which is super handy. If you, whatever lens you have an extra reach on it, which you don't get on the R7 other than in 4K 60. In terms of overheating, I don't really think these cameras are gonna be too much of a problem. I did get the R7 to overheat out in extreme hot and heat situation, which I really pushed the camera. I haven't got to test the R3. It's not really that warm here now, we're in the fall, but in terms of overheating, I don't think in real life practices, either of these are gonna be an issue as long as you have the temp setting on high or whatever it's called and the screen open, not a big deal. In terms of battery life, I've been really impressed with the battery life on the R7, but the nice thing is this has the Pro style body with the huge battery in this camera. It lasts a lot longer, but again, battery life has been great on the R7. The R3 will definitely last longer with that bigger battery. Now let's get into the body shape, ergonomics, build quality, and those sorts of things. As you can see, they are very different cameras, and one thing I just want to point out pretty obviously is that the R3 is a pro style body. It has a huge grip. It is very comfortable to use, and there's a lot of things that come with that, but it's also larger, so that's something else to consider. So taking a look at these two cameras side by side, you obviously they look like very different cameras. The pro style body of the R3 with the built-in battery grip and much larger battery. You also have a lot more buttons and dials, which I'll show you all over these cameras. You even have some customizable buttons in the front. So the R3 is probably the nicest camera I've ever felt in my hands. It's very similar to like a 1DX style camera. And if you are using this camera for professional reasons, you're gonna love this camera, especially with the big battery grip. It's nice to hold. Also, because of that, you get all the built-in vertical features, right? You have all the buttons and controls and stuff over here for shooting vertically. Really awesome. So, all right, let's take a look at the back of the cameras. And this is where you're gonna see a lot of the differences. Of course, the R3 has a lot more buttons and dials and a lot more things going on, which makes it really nice to shoot with. But one thing I do want to mention here are going to be the screens. So the screens are different sizes. So on the R3, we have a 3.2 inch screen, and on the R7, we have a 3-inch screen. The R3 resolution is a lot higher. Also, in terms of the EVF, you can see how the different sizes are here. The EVF on the R3 is absolutely incredible. I don't use the EVF a lot, but as I've been doing some wildlife stuff, I'm using it more. It is huge, as you can see the difference, and you can just see everything. It looks absolutely amazing. Onto the ports, they're gonna be pretty similar. We got a couple extra ones with the R3. We got a flash sync port and Ethernet jack. But they both have micro HDMIs, which you guys know my feelings about, and you get sort of all the normal stuff there. Onto the memory cards, there is a difference here. So on the R7, we're gonna get 2 SD cards. I recommend the ProGrade V90 cards. I'll leave these linked down below. These have been awesome for me. And then also with the R3, we get 1 SD and then 1 CF Express type B card, and I like these cards from Angelbird. They're very inexpensive. They're actually cheaper than the SD cards, and they work great. So I'll leave this link down below as well. All right, so in terms of other features here, as I said, the batteries are gonna be very different. So we have the normal Canon LPE6 NH batteries. As I said, battery life is great on the R7. And then for the R3, we have the bigger 1DX style battery that lasts a whole long time, but it does have a different charger and the batteries are more expensive. It's just another ecosystem that you have to deal with, so you want to keep that in mind. On the top, a little bit of a difference here. Also, we have a screen on the R3, which comes in handy from time to time. But overall, they both feel great. I think the R7, for the price and for what it is, still has a great feeling grip, and I'm glad that they've put it in a little bit larger of a body. It makes it a lot easier to handle. I want to take a moment here to talk about lenses, and I've been talking about this in several other videos, so I don't want to get too far into it, but if you're looking at an R7, you're probably looking for lenses that are smaller and more affordable. And as of right now, Canon only makes 2 RFS, which are the crop sensor RF lenses. I don't know if they're coming out with any more in the future. They're not letting third-party manufacturers make RF autofocus lenses. Very frustrating, but if you're curious about lens options for the R7, I made a full video with a bunch of cool recommendations. I'll leave that down below too. Now let's talk about price. And so the R7 is $1,500. The R3 is $6,000. This is literally 4 times the cost of the R7. For most of the stuff that I showed you earlier and on this video at 4K 24 in terms of image quality, dynamic range, autofocus, Ibis, all that stuff, the R7 is super similar to the R3. Things you're getting with the R3, you're getting that oversampled 4K 60, you're getting 4K 120, you're getting 6K RAW, you're getting a full frame stack sensor and a bigger EVF and LCD and those sorts of things. You're also getting the pro style body with the nice grip and the big battery. But you could buy 4 R7s for the price of an R3. So I know that this is kind of an unfair comparison, and I'm not even talking about photography. There's a lot of amazing photography benefits of the R3. This is a flagship photography camera after all. But I think it's really interesting to sort of see what you get for an additional $4,500 in terms of video. So hopefully you enjoyed this comparison. It was a lot of fun to put together. I'm continually impressed with the R7 over and over and over again, as I said, comparing it with cameras like the R5 and the R3. If you're interested, as I said, down below there are affiliate links, and I'd strongly encourage you to hit subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.